might be late to the party on this, but I've been watching old episodes of an Australian improv comedy show on a free on demand service. This means I've been seeing a great deal of ads for a particular TV show from 2024.
Britain has become the first country in the world to introduce a curfew on all men.
After seeing this half a dozen times, I looked it up to find out more and found that the TV series Curfew was based on the book After Dark by Jayne Cowie, released in some markets, including the United States, as Curfew. I was fascinated and decided that I had to read it. I did, in fact, read it, and I picked it up and finished it on the same day. I had a lot of thoughts about it, and I needed to talk through some of them. So, first of all, there will be spoilers throughout the video. I will try to give a warning specifically before each section to indicate what the spoilers will be. At first, it will be general premise, and then moving into more specific things later on. Also, important to note is that even though this was inspired by seeing ads for the TV show, I haven't seen the TV show. My understanding is that it's a pretty loose adaptation and there's some pretty substantial changes. So everything plot-wise will be about the book, not the show. The book is set in a near future UK, where a curfew has been implemented requiring all men to remain in their homes between the hours of 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. This is enforced by a mandatory tagging system, so men can be electronically monitored to ensure that they are following curfew. Additionally, in the interests of protecting women from harm from domestic violence, all couples have to undergo mandatory cohabitation counselling before they can be certified to live together. Specifically, the story follows three women: Sarah, who is a single mother who works as a tagger; Cass, her teenage daughter; and Helen, a local school teacher. And subsequently, a police detective, Pamela, a few weeks in the future, investigating the murder of one of these women. They've been killed, possibly or even probably by a man. But how can this be, with the curfew in place? At first, I was filled with questions. So all men have to abide by this curfew, from the age of 10 onwards. It's briefly addressed that if a man has to evacuate his home, say due to a fire, he will be picked up by police, as the electronic tagging will alert them. But he won't be charged for a curfew violation if his need to evacuate his home is verified. And we can infer from that that presumably this works the same if he has a medical emergency and needs to receive emergency medical attention after curfew. But how does this society deal with things like hospital admissions? If he does have to go to hospital to receive emergency medical care, does he go into a male-only ward? What about aged care facilities? Are those all gender segregated too? Does the curfew present a problem for gender non-conforming women who might be mistaken for men after curfew by strangers? Is this a known problem that some women have to face? How are intersex people affected? What about trans people? This isn't directly addressed in the story. There are no references specifically to trans characters. We don't know how the society treats gender, if people can still seek things like hormone replacement therapy or gender-confirming medical interventions. The vibe that I get is that people would be treated as the sex that they were assigned at birth, but that's not explicitly canon. And we don't know how people who had transitioned prior to the curfew being implemented would be treated. There must be some number of people who, for example, had changed their gender markers on their legal documents before the curfew was implemented. The curfew was implemented within the lifetime of many of our viewpoint characters. And with the curfew being implemented so recently, when it was first implemented, what happened to all the industries that had to operate within the curfew hours? I mean, men would have had to stop working those jobs, or at least stop working those hours for those jobs. What impact did that have on those industries or society as a whole? Uh, how did society cope with the sudden loss of a significant percentage of the workforce for firefighters, paramedics, hospital staff? What about fly in, fly out work? Are oil rigs now solely staffed by women? Do men still work there, but they travel during daylight hours and their home is set to the work site during curfew? Or do they no longer fly in, fly out, and they just live on site all around the year? This is briefly addressed in an interview with the author, where she said that the economic implications of these roles now having to be done by women has had an effect on society in ways like daycares are now more robust to accommodate for women working all hours, and some industries have had to adjust the uniforms or safety equipment and things like that to accommodate for a predominantly female workforce. But I mean, that would have taken time to implement. What did they do for the beginning period of the curfew when they were adjusting to that significant change? And speaking of adjusting, with the tagging system and the mandatory counseling and things like that, wouldn't all of these things have a really significant economic impact? Even if you're charging men for the tagging system and the cohabitation counseling is through the NHS, this is going to be a big drain on the country's economy. And especially with the massive changes to the workforce, how did the economy remain stable throughout all that? All right, so these are all thoughts that came into my mind, but I, yeah, it feels silly to focus too much on that. I don't read a book with dragons in it and then say, oh, this is unrealistic and dragons aren't real. Like, but it is hard to suspend my disbelief for this book because the society is so similar to our own. I feel like it would have been easier to grapple with some of these questions if it was set further in the future, or if it was set a longer period of time after curfew being implemented, or if it was just a more explicit alternate universe from the beginning. I'm going to be really honest at this point. When I first saw the premise of the book and started reading, I thought this was going in a men's rights, a straw man kind of direction. I mean, a society where men are electronically monitored and held to a strict curfew for women's safety seems to me like a very extreme hypothetical designed to critique radical feminism. Especially given that the story is predicated on the idea that the curfew did not prevent this gruesome murder. So I was genuinely surprised to see that it was being talked about as a story about feminism and female empowerment. This genuinely made me stop and think, what is this book trying to say if it's meant to be read as empowering and not as a critique? So let's go a little deeper into one of our main characters, Sarah. And so, in order to discuss that, I will need to go into more spoilers. So, spoiler warning here specifically for Sarah's character arc. The question here is, are we meant to feel empowered by Sarah? Sarah is a tagger with a chip on her shoulder. Her teenage daughter calls her a man hater. Sarah tases a man and he subsequently dies of a heart attack. She slaps her daughter in the face in a fit of anger. She deliberately hits her ex husband with her car. There's clearly a spectrum here in these actions. Yet hitting someone with her car is the most extreme of these actions, but it was also done because he was breaking the law and harassing her. Slapping her daughter in the face is the most minor of these three actions, but also presented as the least justifiable in the text. The tasing incident, well, that's trickier. She uses the taser because the man has become verbally aggressive while at the tagging center to get his tag refitted. And she obviously didn't mean for him to, or intend for him to die as a result of tasing him. However, after this, she's shown rehearsing a story with witnesses to justify her actions, including exaggerating what he was doing and the threat that he was presenting to make her actions seem more defensible. I hope I don't sound over dramatic here, but this has a thin blue line tone to it to me. I mean, Sarah was enacting violence as an employee of a government agency for electronic monitoring. She is part of a system of violence in this moment that is larger to her as an individual. Flawed female characters are not the problem here. I want to talk briefly about the phenomenon of the good for her story. Sometimes these are stories that are about a female character who is ultimately rewarded for remaining strong against oppression. Think Marta from Knives Out. But these also often include stories where the female characters are doing things that, yes, in real life are bad and criminal and wrong, but we get like a cathartic joy out of watching them. Like Amy Dunn in Gone Girl. There's no problem with good for her stories or good for her villains, even. The reason that I bring this up in conversation with this book, though, is that Sarah falls somewhere between being a sympathetic and empowering character and being a good for her villain, but without being enough to be either. So let's go back to the ex husband that she hit with her car. Earlier in the story, we learn that Sarah's teen daughter Cass holds a grudge against Sarah for deliberately locking her father out of the house and forcing him to break curfew. This is why he was originally arrested and served time in prison. There's discussions between Sarah and other characters about whether Sarah is ever going to tell Cass what kind of man her father really is or what he really did to earn that. My mind was going to extremes here. I was expecting that this was going to culminate in a reveal that he was engaging in sexual violence or persistent abuse or something of that nature. In the end, the reveal is that the impetus for that event was that she discovered that he was having an affair. This felt like an anticlimax, not because I wanted more violence or sexual violence, but the reveal had been teased so much that I thought it was going up to something bigger. This leaves that this is an overreaction from Sarah. And the harassment that she experiences at his hands, the harassment that provoked her to hit him with her car. There are three incidents of harassment that we know about. He leaves a note on her car saying, "I know what you did, you bitch, and you're going to be sorry." He slashes two of her car tires, and he urinates on her parking space. Yes, this would be scary and make her worry about possible escalation. Slashing her tires certainly isn't nothing. That's a violent act against property, yes, but that implies the potential for violence in the future, and it incurs a substantial financial penalty. But altogether, it still doesn't feel substantial enough to warrant that level of response. This means overall, Sarah isn't sympathetic enough that we feel like she's justified, but her actions also aren't exciting enough that we're taking a cathartic joy in it. I don't either sympathize with her or want to cheer her on. I have another point that I feel like I need to discuss, but this one's the biggest spoiler yet. This is the fundamental spoiler of the mystery. Please be warned. Ultimately, it turns out that the murder victim was Helen. The perpetrator was her domestic partner, Tom. Helen's story opens with her and Tom seeking cohabitation counseling. She wants to live with him, she wants to have children with him. And she has to talk the counselor into agreeing to certify them because the counselor does not believe that this would be a good idea for them. And ultimately, that turns out to be a huge mistake. As statistics in the real world tell us, the biggest threat to a woman as far as violence by a man goes is not random in the street, but from a domestic partner. There are a few things about this that invite further questions from me, though. Tom is a scumbag through and through, not just the heinous act at the end, but he grooms a teenager and cheats on his partner with that teenager. Uh, we see him expecting, with every ounce of entitlement, an equal division of household labor, even though he works much fewer hours than his partner at a far less demanding job. In general, like, Tom is framed as everything that is wrong with men. The part that I'm struggling with, though, is that in general, these aren't common among men because they are inherently male traits. These are common because society currently and historically reinforces and teaches men these things. They aren't male problems, they're patriarchy problems. Maybe Tom is like a lazy, cheating scumbag. But why are the problems of men in the world of Curfew still the same as the problems of men in our patriarchal society? If my understanding of the timeline is right, Tom can remember a time before curfew, but his whole adult life is in a world where curfew is in place. There's a few different explanations for Tom in this context. One, Tom is just like that as an individual. As people are in our society, no one is a monolith. This is a Tom problem, not a man problem. Two, he internalized the views of the society before the implementation of curfew and hasn't caught up mentally to the new way that society is structured. Three, the way that the post curfew society is structured continues to reinforce these attitudes and behaviors in men by treating it as a given that they're going to act this way and need to be controlled for the good of society. Or four, the author thinks that his actions and the actions of other male characters in the story are inherently male and not as a result of society's actions. The idea that male violence or aggression is an inherent trait that puts women at risk is a theme throughout the book. Let's go back to Sarah and her ex husband for a moment. Early in the book, we see Sarah reflect on the first time she faced male anger, describing a time when her, at the time, husband had made her feel unsafe with his angry outburst. This is later referred to as a volcanic eruption of anger. She could vividly remember him standing on the path outside their house, yelling at her to let him back in, how she'd stood in the hallway with her heart racing, almost too shocked to breathe. She'd only moved to stop Cass from opening the door. As far as Sarah was concerned, he'd deserved it, but that hadn't made his anger any less frightening. Unless I'm missing something, this reads to me like she had already locked him outside by the time he became angry. This means that the first time Sarah had experienced male anger was a man yelling at her from the other side of a locked door after she had locked him out and forced him to break curfew, which would ultimately lead to his arrest and imprisonment. This being the first time makes it very clear there was no history or pattern of angry outbursts directed towards or around her. I don't want to dispute the idea that a large man shouting at a woman can certainly be very scary. And there are men who use shouting and verbal abuse as a deliberate intimidation tactic against women or against other men. This being framed as a formative, terrifying event for Sarah, though, the question that I have is that the events described don't match up to her response, unless we take it as a given that male anger is always inherently intimidating, regardless of context. I want to compare this as well to a moment between Cass and her best friend Billy. She's stolen a tag key and removed his tag, and for a period of weeks has refused to put it back on. This culminates in her finally agreeing to put the tag back on and then realizing that the tag key has been deactivated. He snatched it from her hand. He examined it. And then Billy, thin, spotty, harmless Billy, lost his temper. This is clearly meant for us to read Billy as a red herring murderer. This comes moments before the reveal of the identity of both murder victim and murderer. So we're meant to wonder in this moment if Billy has snapped and killed Cass. This turns out to not be the case, of course. And ultimately, we never learn what Billy losing his temper looked like. This is framed very ominously, even if not a murderer. We're clearly meant to see that this is a scary moment for Cass, but in later chapters from her perspective, we don't get any clarity on what that looked like. I mean, did he raise his voice? Did he swear at her? Did he hit her? We don't know. She doesn't say. I would assume that if he was physically violent, that would have been mentioned, but there's nothing. The logical conclusion, therefore, about both of these moments is that the author assumes that we will simply understand that these moments are unsafe because they're male anger. When it comes to the murder itself, and in fact, the stories of Billy and Sarah's ex husband as well, there's another sticking point. Now, obviously, the person most at fault for the murder is Tom. There is no question about that. No one made him do that. He holds sole responsibility for his heinous actions. But with the focus of the book on the curfew and the other strategies implemented to keep women safe from violence perpetrated by men, like the cohabitation counseling, it becomes increasingly apparent by the end of the book that all of the violence that we do see and all of the opportunities for violence that we see are only possible because of failures within the system that the world has put in place. Helen never would have been victimized by Tom if she hadn't talked the counselor into giving them a cohabitation certificate against her better judgment. Sarah's ex husband, who has been breaking curfew to harass her, and Cass's friend Billy, who's been breaking curfew to avoid domestic violence in his own home, are only able to do that because Cass used the stolen tag key to remove or adjust their tags. In the world of this society, these things should be more protected against. Now, this isn't necessarily a criticism. Systems that are supposed to keep people safe do frequently fail in real life as well as in fiction. It just all leaves me wondering what the point is. Am I supposed to conclude that if the system had worked as intended, if these failures had been better safeguarded against, that it would have worked and that women would not be in danger from men? Is the point that women are always in danger from men, no matter what methods are put in place to protect them? That men will always find a way to harm women? If that's the message, why is it the failures on a society level that that cause these things to happen, that make these things possible? I'm genuinely not sure. And look, maybe part of the problem, maybe the problem with everything I've said so far is that I'm just overthinking it. I mean, another Instagram post by Jayne Cowie calls the book a somewhat bonkers idea that she had. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. As an extreme thought experiment and as a setting for a thriller, it's okay if things aren't that deep. But I keep trying to look for more. I want there to be more. The author's note for After Dark reads in part: I wondered, not for the first time, what we would do if we really valued female lives. We've seen in the past that if you want social change, you must first change the law. So that's where I started. And then I threw in a handful of female characters who were all at different stages of their journey through womanhood and asked one key question: will men always be a threat? I'll let you be the judge of that. To me, this turns it from a bonkers thought experiment into a statement. And one that I don't think the book does a very good job of supporting. I I'm not questioning the need to do more about violence against women. I just don't think that Jayne Cowie and I see eye to eye on how to do that. Ultimately, I feel that positioning male violence as an inherent trait of men is deeply flawed and not a helpful approach. If male violence is an inherent trait that cannot be changed, only guarded against, this ultimately takes responsibility for committing violence away from the perpetrators. If violence is an inherent quality that men have, how can we ultimately hold them responsible for acting on that? This takes away the horror of the violent acts and it reinforces a low standard for men. If we can't expect a man to be anything other than violent, doesn't this encourage men not to bother? And doesn't this encourage women to settle for men who are only a little bit shit? But more than that, it takes away the society responsibility to address these issues. In a world where male violence takes place because it's an inherent trait of men, where is the motivation for meaningful systemic change? Addressing male violence because that stems from patriarchy, where violence is a learned trait based on a sense of power and entitlement, would involve dismantling the systems that reinforce those things. By comparison, a curfew is an easy way out. Aren't we better than that? Oh, well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed my video. I would really appreciate it if you liked, commented, subscribed, whatever it is that works for you. I don't make videos very often, but I do have a lot of fun with it. So, I would really appreciate the dopamine hit from getting some feedback. Thanks, everyone.